I hope you can hear me clearly. I'm recording Daf Kuf Yud Chet, 118 in Masechet Zevachim, three before the end, because I'm going to be traveling, and so I don't think I will be able to do this live. But if I can, I will. So Daf Kuf Yud Chet. So I'm going to start a little bit earlier because I don't know where we'll get up to next week, and likely this first part will be a review. But the Mishnah on Kuf Yud Zayin, not the Mishnah, the Gemara on Kuf Yud Zayin quoted a Braita, a Tana Rabbanan, which discussed many opinions about which karbanot can be performed on a bamat yachid, meaning there's what's called a bamat yachid and a bamat tzibor, right? A private bama, which is permitted during certain times, say Nov and Givon and Gilgal. You can do your own karban on a bamat yachid, but at those times there also existed a bamat tzibor, say in Nov and Givon. So there are certain karbanot you can do in one, certain in the other, and that was the machloket in the Braita. Rabbi Yehuda, which was maybe the predominant opinion in the Braita, if you recall yesterday, said essentially that in a bamat tzibor, both the tzibor can bring karbanot, especially things that are chayav zman, but that also an individual can bring karbanot in a bamat tzibor, but in a bamat yachid you can only bring limited karbanot, which are nidava. But the Chachamim came and said, and that's where we're starting today, 5 lines from the bottom of Kuf Yud Zayin Amabet, Amar Mar, the Chachamim said, no. Kol shatzibur makrivim ba'olam moed, anything that a tzibur can bring on an olam moed, I'm going to read the Chachamim, shebemidbar, makrivim ba'olam moed shebegilgal. But kan v'kan lo karvu yachid al olah shlamim bovad. But whether you're talking about a bamat yachid or a bamat tzibur, an individual, a yachid, can only bring a shlamim and an ola. Says Gemara, why? So, I mean, you're saying that a yachid cannot bring a karban that's a chovah on a bamat tzibur. Why tamayad rabbanan? Amar Kra, because remember, this is all based on the pasuk which says that when you get to Eretz Yisrael, I'm going to read the pasuk, I think, Vayamim ahim, right? This is referring to Sefer Shoftim, Ein melech b'Yisrael ish hayashar be'inav yaseh. Every person did what was fair in his own eyes. What does that tell you? That ish, if you're a person, an individual bringing a karban, even on a karban on a bamat tzibor, even in Gilgal, you can only bring what is yashar, what you chose to do. Yeshrutu delikriv. You can bring the thing that you chose to do, but chovot lo likruvu. A thing that you're required to bring, like a karban chatat or all kinds of other karbanot, an individual, an ish, cannot bring those. Tzibor, now, but if you're a public, you're not an ish, then afilu chovot tikarev, right? So then even a tzibor can bring chovot. So even on a bamat tzibor, only a tzibor can bring a requirement. A yachid cannot bring a karban of requirement, even on a bamat tzibor like Gilgal. So what does Rabbi Yehuda say to that pasuk? Rabbi Yehuda amar lecha, no. Kichtiv hayashar be'inav hu dichtiv, right? When it says hayashar be'inav, it's referring to that which you see fit, right? Meaning, it's referring to the place where you choose. Hayashar be'inav is referring to if you chose a place, you have your own bama, you can only bring the karbanot that you chose to bring, which is a shlamim and an ola. Aval bebama gidola, but if it's on a bama gidola, meaning a public bama like Gilgal or Nova Givon, afilu chovot nami l'karev, an individual can even bring a chova, a karban chova. Says, okay, but you conveniently left out the word ish. Elahachtiv ish, right? The pasuk says the word ish, right? And the word ish seems to imply man, meaning an individual. Lav lememra the ish yisharotu delikriv hachovot lo likriv, right? The Chachamim's whole proof was from the word ish. The Torah says a man can bring a karban that he, or a person can bring a karban that he chooses, meaning that only a karban he chooses can he bring. He can't bring a chovah. Answers Rabbi Yehuda, no. Kichtiv ish lachshir tazar. Ish is there to tell you something completely different, which is that you don't need a kohen, right? You can have a zar bring a karban. Ish is there to tell you not that an individual only brings certain karbanot, but that an individual can bring a karban because you don't need to have a kohen on a bamat yachid. Well, we're going to prove, again, I don't remember exactly where we are because I'm going back and forth. I think it might be tomorrow's daf, but the word, the proof of zar, right? The fact that a zar, which remember we said in our Mishnah, a zar is permitted, a non-kohen is permitted to do avodah on a bama, that we learn later from the pasuk zaraka kohen dam al mizbeach Hashem nafka. Right? We learn from the pasuk it says a kohen is zorek, zoreak, does zorek does the sacrifice on the Mizbech Hashem, implying that only on the Mizbech Hashem do you need a Kohen, but on Mizbech Prati, you don't need a Kohen. So we knew that from the words Zaraka Kohen et Adam al Mizbech Hashem. Why do you need another pasuk of Ish? It's true, says the Gemara. You would have known from that pasuk that only Kohanim work in the Beit HaMikdash or in a Bamat Sibur. But Ma'adatema, I would have thought Libai Kiddush Bechorot Kimeikara. Right? Remember, before the Kohanim, the Bechorot were in charge. So you might think if you're not using a Kohen on a Bamat Yachid, you have to find a Bechor. You have to find a community Bechor, if you're not a firstborn, to do your Karban for you. Kamash Malam, the word Ish, that anyone can do it. So Ish means that any individual can bring a Karban, but it doesn't mean, like the Chachamim said, according to Rabbi Yehuda saying, it doesn't mean that it's only an individual's karbanot can only be nidava. An individual on a bamat yachid, Rabbi Yehuda says, can only bring nidava, right? Ola and shlamim. But on a bamat sibur, even an individual, according to Rabbi Yehuda, can bring a karban that's a chova. And the Chachamim, of course, disagreed. Ask the Gemara, 1 second. The Chachamim haynu tanakama, right? The Chachamim is the same opinion of the Tanakama earlier in the Braita. Remember, in the Braita, basically, it said Chachamim Omrim twice. But in the first Chachamim Omrim, which says, I'll read it now, Lo karvu yachid al lo shlamim bilvad. So that seems like the same thing the second Chachamim said. So why are they repeating it twice? Amar of Papa, the difference between them is a machloket that we had a week ago, which for me is today, which is karvu nisachim ba midbar ikabeinayo. The whole question is, you brought a karban in the midbar, right? But did you bring nisachim with that karban, right? And we talked about this in general because if you brought nisachim in the midbar, it meant you also brought nisachim when you got into Eretz Yisrael and you were doing it on a bama, right? Because remember, the pasuk comes after the midbar and says, when you get into Eretz Yisrael, bring nisachim. So we said a week ago that depends on how you view the midbar. If in the midbar they brought nisachim, then the Torah is saying when you get to Eretz Yisrael, bring nisachim. It's saying even on a bamat yachid. If in the midbar they didn't bring nisachim, then the Torah is saying when you get to Eretz Yisrael in a bamat sibur, bring nisachim. So that's the machloken between the two chachamim. Everyone agrees on the karbanot. The question is, can you bring nisachim along with those karbanot? Okay, continues the Gemara now. Amar Mar. We are 10 lines from the top of Kuf Yud Chet Amud Aleph. So then we get the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon's opinion, if you recall, again, this is all from the Braita yesterday. Rabbi Shimon said, this was the bottom of Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, that Af Tzibor lo hakrivo el psachim v'chavot shekavu lehem zman. The truth is that even at Tzibor, even on a Bamat Tzibor, they didn't bring all the karbanot. They only brought very specific karbanot, and that was the karban Pesach and other karbanot that have a fixed time. But if you have a chova that, like let's say a chatas or a musaf of Rosh Chodesh or something, but let's say you have a chova that doesn't have a fixed time, like a parhalam davar shel tzibor, they would not have brought that even as the tzibor. It has to be similar to the karban Pesach, which has a fixed time. Right? You bring the karban Pesach on your Daled of Nisan. So says where my Tamai to Rabbi Shimon. What is the reason for Rabbi Shimon's opinion? Dichtiv, it's based on the pasuk in Yehoshua. The pasuk in Yehoshua says that the Bnei Yisrael, I have now this Gemara so I can read it. It says in the 5th parak of Yehoshua, V'yachanu Bnei Yisrael b'Gilgal. Bnei Yisrael camped at Gilgal, and now we're quoting the next part of the pasuk. V'yasu at Pesach. They did the Pesach b'Arba'asar Yom l'Chodesh be'erev. Okay, they did the Pesach on the 14th day. So that's the pasuk. It says the Gemara Pshita. What, that pasuk doesn't make any sense. Like, I mean, it's not true, it's not false, but it's obvious. Of course they did the Karban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. What else would they do? Torah already said, do Karban Pesach. Eloha Kamashmon, the Torah is telling you they did the Karban Pesach to tell you that is the kind of Karban they brought when they went into Eretz Yisrael, before they had a Bamat Sibur, right? Before they had, Shiloh, right? They had a Bamat Sibor in Gilgal, and they did a chova, but only Ke'ein Pesach Hu Dekarev. The only chovot you're allowed to bring in Gilgal are those that are similar to Karban Pesach. When you get to Shiloh, you're going to bring all the rest. But before you get to Shiloh, in those 14 years, right, 14 years of Gilgal, you only can bring chovot that are like Karban Pesach. Halav Ke'ein Pesach Lo Karev. If it's not like Pesach, you don't bring it. So that is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Okay? Veidach. So what are the Chachamim who argue with Rabbi Shimon and say you can bring other karbanot sibor even if they're not kavul lehem zman? What do they do with this? Why is the Torah telling me that they brought a karban Pesach on the 14th? that is telling you a whole nother halacha, which is a really tricky and interesting halacha, which is mibayla dikir Rabbi Yochanan. This is for the thing that Rabbi Yochanan, of course, taught us later. Dam Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Bana arel mikabel haza'ah. Really interesting halacha that a person who's an arel, who's never had a brit milah, who's not allowed to do carbon pesach, and also is prohibited for many things, right? He, not many things, but some things, he can get haza'ah, I guess only male if it's an RL, can get haza'ah for tomei mate. Now remember, if a person is impure, in order to become pure, they have to have 7 days where they don't become tamei. And then on the third day, they have to get sprinkling of the water of the paraduma. And on the seventh day, sprinkling again. And then they're tahor, okay? So the challenge here is that the Jewish people, when they got out of the desert, they were mostly arelim. The pasuk says that, right? They did that, and I have the pasuk here again, I think. I don't know the yeah. Pasuk says, "Kimulim hayu kol ha'am hayotzim." All the people left Mitzrayim had a brit milah, but chol ha'am hayilodim b'midbar b'derech lo malu. All the people were born in the 40 years of the desert. They didn't give a brit milah. It was dangerous. It was not safe to do a brit milah in the desert. So they all came to Eretz Yisrael. And pretty much everyone did not have a brit milah. Some individuals, I guess, if you were born in Egypt and were not too old, and you didn't die in the Meraglim, though almost everyone died in the Meraglim, they would have brit milah. But everyone who was under the age of 40 did not have a brit milah. Furthermore, almost everyone was tamei mate. And the reason they were tamei mate is because all their parents died, right? Everyone died in the desert. So every son who went and attended his father's funeral and buried his father was now tamei mate, and there was no opportunity to become tahar during the time in the desert. So not every Jew, but almost every Jew showed up to Eretz Yisrael, tamei, mate, and in RL, neither of those are things that you can do and bring a carbon pesach. So they have to become tahar. The problem is that the third day and the seventh day are the days you have to do haza'ah, right? They only came, the pasuk says that when they came to Gilgal, it was the 10th day of Nisan. So if on the 10th day of Nisan you did the haza'ah, the third day, and then on the 14th day of Nisan you did the second haza'ah, then that night you're tahar and you can eat the carbon pesach. So that's great. But if you delayed your haza'ah from the 10th of Nisan to the 11th or the 12th of Nisan, then you're not going to become tahar before carbon pesach. So they must have done haza'ah on the 10th and the 14th. The problem was they couldn't do brit milah on the 10th, because you can't do brit milah the day you arrive from travel. You're still tired, your body's not rested. So you have to wait till the next day to do brit milah. So they clearly had to do the brit milah on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th, but they already had to do the haza'ah on the 10th. So you see from here that you can do haza'ah on an arel. Even though these people did not have a brit milah yet, their haza'ah on the third day was kosher. And so they did haza'ah on the third day, which was the 10th of Nisan. They did brit milah, let's say, on the 11th of Nisan. The 14th of Nisan, they did another haza'ah, and then they were able to eat the carbon pesach that night. And so that's why the Torah tells us about the carbon pesach, not to tell me that all karbanot that are done in a bama have to be like a carbon pesach. Okay, that is the machloket of Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim. Continues the Gemara now. Sorry, around 20 lines from the top. Tani Tana Kamei Rav Ada bar Ava. There was a Tana who said over a Braita in front of Rav Ada bar Ava, and he said the following principle: Ein bein bama gedola lebama ketana. There's no difference between a big bama, right? A big bama meaning like a bama at Gilgal, or a bama ketana, which is the bama in your backyard. The only difference between those two is Pesach v'chavot hakavu lem zman. Only carbon Pesach, and which you only do in the bama gedola. They had to do a Gilgal. And chovot that are fixed time, like I said, like Shabbos, like a Musaf or things like that. Amar lei, so they said to this, Rabbi Ada bar Ava said to this Tana, Yachid, 1 second, by an individual, right? How do you know chovot shekavod lem zman menale? How do you know that well, not really, menale is not the real word, but meaning why would you have to say that, right? Because basically there's no such thing as an individual, a yachid, doing a karban that's kavul lehem zman, right? Chovot are on the tzibur; they're not on the individual. So why did you say that between a bama yachid, which is bama ketana, and a bama gedola, it's only Pesach and chovot? There's no chovot on a bama ketana because the individual doesn't bring them. Amar lei, so he said to him, okay, asmaya, should I then remove it? I mean, should I take it out of the Braita and basically teach the Braita differently and say, Ein bein bama ketana, bama gedola, except for Pesach? Amrle said Rav Rava, well, if you learned it, there's probably a rationale for it. And what I would explain, to Targem Matnitach, I would explain your Mishnah as referring to an Olat Chova, right? You can have an Ola that is a Chova, which as opposed to Tika Olat Ndava, right? It could be referring to a Chova of an Ola. What's the Chova of an Ola? Which is that on every Chag, you're supposed to bring an olat riyah, or you're supposed to bring a carbon for showing up to the Beit HaMikdash. So there's a difference between olat chova and olat nidava. You can just say, on my backyard, I want to bring an olat nidava. Every chag, I have to bring an olat chova. One applies in Gilgal and one does not. But you can't explain that it's referring to a chatas, the chatat yachidhu. If you're talking about a chatat for an individual, chavot kveilem zman miika. There is no chova of a yachid that's kavul lemzman by a chatat, right? An individual is to bring a chatat if they do a sin, but there's no chatat that an individual brings every year or every 3 years. There's chatot that a tzibur brings, right? Like a carbon chatat of a musaf, but there's no chatat that a yachid brings. So describe the bright as referring to an ola, but not to a chatat. Ask Gemara, but what about a mincha? The mincha is certainly something that you can bring with the chova, right? But look, minchat chova. What's the minchat chova? The ikach chavitim. There's the minchat chavitim, which was a requirement for a kohen gadol, right? The kohen gadol had to bring a minchat chavitim every single day, so it's a responsibility on an individual. It's time bound. Says the Gemara, well, yeah, the reason we include mincha is because summer ain't mincha bebama. This Tana holds, like we've seen before, many Tanaim hold, there's no mincha on a bama. So mincha is not even in the discussion. The discussion is only animals and birds. And the thing about animals is that there's no chatat that's a chova on an individual. There's only chatot that are chova on a tzibur. Okay, so that is why you have to explain your braita referring to a carbon ola. Okay, we're now at the 2 dots, 15 lines from the bottom. In the Mishnah we learned a week ago on Daf Kuf Yud Bet, said that after a long time they came to Shiloh, and in Shiloh they didn't have a roof, right? They just had walls that were made out of stone, and they had curtains on top of it. It says in Gemara Menani Mili, how do you know that's what Shiloh looked like? That there was no roof on Shiloh, and that there were curtains on a pedestal, on like walls. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because the Torah, when it describes Shiloh, uses very different descriptions. In Shmuel, it says, Katuv Echad Omer, but Teviehu, they brought it, or she brought him. This is referring to Chana, right? Chana brought Shmuel. Taviehu Beit Hashem Shiloh. She brought him to Shiloh, so it's called Beit Hashem. It sounds like a house. House usually has walls and a roof. But there's other psukim, mainly in Tehillim, these 2 psukim we're about to quote, that talk about the Yitosh Mishkan Shiloh, Ohel Shikein Ba'adam, that Hashem set up the Yitosh means ignored, right? Deserted the Mishkan of Shiloh, the Ohel that Hashem had put among people. So you see that Shiloh was a Mishkan, was an Ohel. And it says, Vayim Aspa Yosef, that Hashem rejected the tent of Yosef, which we think refers to Shiloh, because it was in the space of Yosef. So you see that Shiloh is referred to both as a house, as Beit Hashem, and as an Ohel. How do you explain that? Ketzad? The answer is it's in between. Lo hayta sham tikra, there was no roof. El avanim milamatan, there were stones underneath. V'riyot milamalan, and curtains on top. V'i hayta menucha, and this is what the Torah refers to. We're going to discuss this more tomorrow, meaning in Daf Kuf Yotat, that when the Torah talks about Yilobatim Arata El HaMenucha Vel HaNachala, you haven't come to the Menucha and the Nachala. The Menucha is referring to Mishkan Shiloh. So we said in the Mishnah that during the time of Shiloh, they would have Kachei Kadashim, and the Kachei Kadashim, remember, have to be in the walls of the Beit HaMikdash, of the Mishkan. Says, and then we continued, and we said, and Kachim Kalim and Maaser Sheni, you can eat Bechol HaRo'eh, wherever you can see the Mishkan. Minani Mili, how do you know that you're allowed to eat these things wherever you can see it? Amar Boshai Damar Kra, because the pasuk says, this is a pasuk back in Ekev and Dvarim, Hishamer Lecha, right? Be careful. Pen Taleh Olotecha B'chol Makom Asher Tir'eh. Don't bring your olot in any place where you can see. Now, what is it referring to? What do you mean you can see? What it's telling you is that B'chol Makom Asher Tir'eh Yatamala. Just because you can see the Mishkan or see the Beit HaMikdash, you can't bring a karban there. You have to be inside. But you can eat there. So don't bring your olah or your karban where you can see the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan, but you can eat your karban anywhere you can see the Mishkan. That's what it's teaching it. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Pasuk says, don't bring it, right? Bring it, meaning sacrifice it on the Mizbeach. But maybe Ema, what the pasuk means to tell you is b'chol makom she'ata ro'eh et yamaleh. Just because you can see the Mishkan means you can't bring a karban there. You have to go there to bring the karban. Avata zoveach b'chol makom she'tereh. Instead of saying, but you can then eat it wherever you can see, maybe it means you can slaughter it wherever you can see, and maybe you're allowed to shecht your karban outside the Mishkan where you can see the Mishkan, and then you bring the meat or the blood and you pour it on the Mizbeach. How do you know that that's not the case? Amar Rabbi Yana, he says Rabbi Yana, well, it's because if you look at the next pasuk, Amar Kra, it says, Sham ta'aleh v'sham ta'aseh, right? You have to bring your carbon there, and you have to do it there. What does do it there means? All of the avodah of the carbon, meaning the shchita and the kabbalah and the holacha and the zrika and the burning happens inside the Mishkan. The eating can happen outside, and that's what we learn from that pasuk. So that is the proof. The bottom line of Daf Kuf Yechet Amud Aleph, we have another proof. And what is that? Avdimi Bar Chassa said, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, turn the page, Velo Ta'anat Shiloh. It was called Ta'anat Shiloh. And Rashi says the word Ta'ana comes from the word of moaning, right? Taniya va'aniya, as we say by the Churban Habayit. And so that's the place where they wailed and they were sad about Shiloh, meaning Mekom, it's referring to a place, Shekol HaRo'eh, to anyone who sees Shiloh from that place, Mitaneyach, they will groan, and they'll say, Mitaneyach alav al chilat kachim shelo. They'll say, oh, we used to eat our karbanot here, and now we can no longer eat our karbanot. So you see from here that you could eat the karbanot outside of Shiloh wherever you can see Shiloh, meaning there was a place where they would all stand and they would eat their karbanot. It was like a beautiful promenade, maybe on a hill with picnic tables. And unfortunately, once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, or the Mishkan was destroyed, it was called Ta'anat Shiloh because it was the place where people would come and would moan over Shiloh because they couldn't eat their karbanot there anymore. So that's how you prove. Again, it's a proof from Yoshua. It's not, well, I'll talk about it in a second. It's not a pasuk in the Chumash, but it's a proof from an asmachta that was where you can eat for Shiloh. Now Rashi here, it's a very sweet Rashi. The Rashi's on both sides of the Gemara here, if you're confused. But Rashi on the right side says a beautiful thing, which is Lo Tanat Shiloh. I'm reading Rashi now, top line on the top right. Chipastiv v'lo mitzativ v'mikra. I searched and I didn't find this pasuk. So Rashi, went through Tanakh, and I don't know what that means exactly, but obviously he looked at the section where it's supposed to be, and this pasuk does not exist, right? So it's a mistake. There is a similar pasuk that Rashi quotes in Yeshua, where it says that the border of Mizracha was Ta'anat Shiloh. So that's probably what it's referring to. I don't know, it's just an editing mistake, but just very nice that Rashi, checked and couldn't find this kind of pasuk. So that is the second proof that you're allowed to eat karban, kachim kalim, and maaser sheni, bichol haro'eh, wherever you can see Mishkan Shiloh. Rabbi Avo says, I have another pasuk, and it's from the Parshas Vayechi, which I'm recording this on Motzaei Shabbat Vayechi, but hopefully by the time you hear it, it'll be Motzaei Shabbat Shmot, But the pasuk says, Amar Kra, Bein Parat Yosef. Yosef is a fruitful son, right? Bein Parat Alei Ayin. Yosef is a vine that rises up. Ayin means it goes up. And how do we understand that? That's referring not to alei ayin, that it goes up, that it rises, but it's an eye. And we're blessing Yosef. Yaakov was blessing Yosef. Ayin shelo ra'ata lizon le'anot midavar she'eno shelo. The eye that wouldn't take and benefit from that which wasn't his. Remember, Yosef rejected Potiphar's wife, Bat Potiphar, right? Eshet Potiphar, and wouldn't take that which was inappropriate for him. Tiskeh v'tochel k'melo einah. He is zocheh, his descendants, his Yerusha, to eat the karban and to have a Mishkan that it extends wherever you can see. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina Amar, from a different pasuk, now the bracha of Yaakov to Yosef, but the bracha of Moshe to Yosef. It says in Dvar, in Zot HaBracha, Ritzon Shochni Sneh, he will dwell in the sneh. Sneh usually means a bush. But we're deriving sneh a little bit differently. We're saying ayin shelo ratzta lehonot mitavar she'en shelo, the eye of Yosef that didn't want to benefit from that which wasn't his. Tiskeh v'tochel bein hasinuim. You should be able to eat the karban based on the Mishkan Shiloh among those who hate him. What does that mean, among those who hate him? This is a crazy pshat of Rashi. Those who hate him means the other shvatim, right? Remember, all the brothers hated Yosef. It says the brothers continued l'sno oto, and so now Yosef's influence will extend even among the haters, meaning even outside of Mishkan Shiloh, if there's another tribe nearby, well, there weren't that many tribes nearby, but let's just say there was another tribe nearby which had a high mountain, you could see the Mishkan. That's where Yosef's going to say, look, you can eat my karban even in this place. So Yosef's reach extends well beyond the Mishkan to wherever you can see the Mishkan. Tana, now says the Braita, what does that mean you can see it? Ro'eh Shamru, when they say you can see the Mishkan, it means Ro'eh Kulo. It means you can see the whole thing. Below HaMafsik Beino Leveino, there's nothing in between. Meaning you could be there and they built a new, like in Riverdale, right? They built a new apartment building next to you and you can't see it anymore. You can't eat it. It's not that you're in a place which could have seen it. You have to physically be able to see it. Amar le Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim and Rabbi Elazar. Says Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim and Rabbi Elazar, let me give you an example. It's like the Bnei Knishta Dimaon. Now, that's a place, I don't know where it is, but it is next to Tveria. And from Tveria, from the Beit Knishta Dimaon, you can see Tveria. So he's giving an example of like a place where we say you could see Tveria if that was the city. In this case, it was Shiloh. From the Beit Knishta Dimaon, you can see Tveria. So that's obviously not a context for us that is very helpful because we do not go where that place is, but that was relevant place for those people. Amar Rav Papa, now says Rav Papa, I just want to also clarify. When we say Ro'eh Shamru, Lo Ro'eh Kulo, I disagree. You don't have to see the entire Mishkan. Ela Ro'eh Miktsato, you can even see part of it. Now, it's not necessarily arguing with the earlier. Remember, earlier we said there can't be something mafsik. Rav Papa is basically saying that as long as there's nothing separating, you don't have to be able to see the whole Mishkan, you just have to have a clear line of sight to part of it. Now, by Rav Papa, asked Rav Papa the question, which I'm sure everyone's been wondering, which is, Omeid v'ro'ev yoshev ein ro'eh mai. Let's say if you're in a place, if you stood up and you looked from the top, you can see it. But when you sit down, you don't see it. So is that you see it or you don't see it? By Rabbi Yirmiyah had another question. What if it's something where you're talking about a nachal, which is a hill, basically, right, a stream, where you go min al gabe hanachal v'ro'eh. If you stand on the top of the bank, you can see it. But if you go into the bank, meaning Yoshe B'toch HaNachal, if you're standing inside the riverbed, ein ro'eh. Again, does that mean you can see it or not see it? My and Teiko, we don't resolve these questions. So not terribly practical, but open questions. Now, Ki Ata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came, where my Gemara has a dot, I don't know if everyone's does, but it's around 15 lines from the top of Kuf Yud Chet Amud Bet. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said, Amar Rebbe, quoted in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that Bishlosha Mikomot Sharta Shechina Yisrael. There were 3 way stations where the Shechina rested on Klal Yisrael. And the 3 stations were Shiloh, right, the Mishkan Shiloh, Nov and Givon, which I mentioned before, we always count as one. Obviously, it's 2 places. And I think someone here changes the gears to 4 places because it's obviously 4 places. But yeah, the Shita here, my Shita has Arba in some places, but either way, Nov and Givon are always treated like one place. They're very different locations, but they were similar kind of status. And we'll see that was because there was no Aron in those places. And Beit HaLamim, and of course the Beit HaMikdash. So those are the 3 places. Bekulan, says Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, this is the tradition that Rav Dimi came down with from Eretz Yisrael. In all 3 places, or all 4 places, Lo Sharta Ela B'Chelek Binyamin. The Shechina only came in Chelek Binyamin. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, we're very familiar with us at the end of Zot HaBracha, Chofeif alav kol hayom, bein ktefav shachin, right? That Hashem loves Binyamin and will dwell, right, securely, and covers him. Chofeif means covers him all day long and rests in that place. So that the Shechina covers Binyamin. Kol chafifot lo yu el b'chelek shel Binyamin. The coverings of the Shechina, the presence of the Shechina is only in chelek shel Binyamin. So that is what Rav Dimi said in the name of Rebbe. Now, you are probably standing here and wondering, this is crazy, right? Because the Mishkan Shiloh was nowhere near Binyamin. But before you ask that question, Abaya came and said this over. Ki azal Abaya, when Abaya came, now remember, Abaya's the 3rd generation, I think, or 3rd generation of Amoraim. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi came, told this to Rav Dimi, who must have told it to someone who told it to Abaya. Abaya came and he said, Amr Kamed Rav Yosef, right? Abaya was a student of Rav Yosef, a real Kavua student of Rav Yosef. Abaya said to Rav Yosef, I heard this great statement from Rav Dimi from a couple generations ago. And Rav Yosef said to Abaya, you're crazy. This is ridiculous. Amr, Rav Yosef said to Abaya, one of the deepest put downs in the Gemara. Chad bra havile l'chayil. There was Chayil, Rashi's Chayil must have been by his father's name. Your father, Chayil, had one son, and he turned out to be nothing. Lo mitzkan, and he didn't work out. I mean, your dad had one chance, and you screwed it up. That's really what Rav Yossi said to Abaya. How could you say something so silly that all three places where the Shechina is Shora, meaning Shiloh, Noven Givon, and Yerushalayim, are under the territory of Binyamin? Achtiv, it says, Vayitosh et Mishkan Shiloh. Remember, we quoted the pasuk before that Hashem says, it's a pasuk in Tehillim. I gave up on Mishkan Shiloh. Vayim'as b'ohel Yosef u'b'shevet Ephraim lo bachar. I neglected. I got rid of the tent of Yosef and Shevet Ephraim. Shiloh's not anywhere near Binyamin. It's in Yosef and Ephraim. What are you talking about? Amar Ada, said Rav Ada, okay, that's a good question, but why are you so upset, Rabbi Yochanan? Not if he's speaking to Rav Yosef, I mean. My kakashale, what's your big question? Dilma, what it means to say is that the Shechina was B'chelik Binyamin, V'Sanhedri Gedola B'chelik B'Yosef. Maybe the Sanhedrin Gedola, which remember, the Sanhedrin always sits in Lishkat HaGazin next to the Beit HaMikdash, or the Mishkan, was actually in Yosef, but the Shechina was next to it, and meaning maybe it's right next to it, just like the Beit HaMikdash, right? Everybody knows, I don't know how everyone knows this, but we all know this, that in the Beit HaMikdash, it was separate between the Chelik of Binyamin and the Chelik of Yehuda. Right? Remember, there was a line right down the Beit HaMikdash that covered each of those. So maybe it's like that. Just like we find with the Beit HaMikdash, the Shechina b'chalko sheBinyamin, v'Sanhedrin b'chelik Yehuda. That the outside chamber, the Shkat HaGazit, where the Sanhedrin sat, was in Yehuda, because remember, the Yehuda has to always be the Sanhedrin, and the Beit HaMikdash itself was in Binyamin. So maybe the same thing was true about the Mishkan. That the Mishkan Shiloh was in the chelik of near Binyamin and Ephraim, or near Binyamin and Yosef, and that's why it was the Shechina was over Binyamin. So Amar Lei, so he said to him, Rav Yehuda said to, Rav Yosef said to him, Hachiashta, I don't understand what you're saying. Hatam, look, there, when you talk about Yerushalayim, and you're talking about the Beit HaMikdash, Mikarvan Nachalot Gabi Adadi, the territory of Yehuda and territory of Binyamin were next to each other. And so this was built on the Gvul, right? But Hacha, Mi Mikarvan, they're not close to each other. Now, what does it mean they're not close to each other? It is true, just to be clear, that if you go above Jerusalem, the first Shevet is Binyamin, and then comes Ephraim. So Binyamin and Ephraim are next to each other. But Shiloh is nowhere near the border between Ephraim and Binyamin. Unlike Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, which is the border of Yehuda and Binyamin, Shiloh is nowhere near the border. Says the Gemara, well, that's true, but they extended the border. Hachanami, right, here too, Mikarvan, they brought them close. Kedam Rabbi Chama, Rabbi Chanina, Ritzua Haita Yotzeit Michalko Shel Yehuda, V'nichnas L'Chalko Shel Binyamin. There was a small strip of land that went out of Yehuda's portion. I'm talking now back about Yerushalayim, that went into the Shevet Chelik of Binyamin. Uba Hayam Mizbeach Banu, and they actually used that tiny strip of land to build a Mizbeach, so that the Mizbeach was on the land of Yehuda, even though everything else in the Beit HaMikdash was Binyamin. Binyamin HaTzadik Mitzta'er La Levala. And Binyamin, the Tzadik, we always call Binyamin HaTzadik, but the Shevet of Binyamin wanted to swallow up that land. They didn't want to give him space. But maybe the same thing happened by Mishkan Shiloh. Hachanami, maybe there was a Ritzua, Michalkosh Yosef, the Chalkosh Binyamin. Now, it was probably the opposite way, but anyways, the Gemara says it this way, that there was a Ritzua that left the Chelik of Yosef, went into Chelik Binyamin, and the Mishkan was built on that spot. And that's another reason why it might say that the border was Ta'anat Shiloh, right? Meaning that basically Rashi explains that the Shevet Binyamin was Ta'ana, was complaining. Remember we said before, people were complaining they couldn't eat the karbanot anymore. But here it's maybe that the complaints came from Binyamin that they didn't have the Mishkan. That they thought the Mishkan would be in their property, but it was a strip of land from Yosef that came into their place. And so they were complaining that they lost the Mishkan, the space of the Mishkan, to Yosef. It says, it's actually a machloket Tanaim, because there's one Braita that says, remember the pasuk says, we quoted this pasuk a little bit before about Binyamin, that chofeif alav kol hayom, right? Uben ktefav shachin, that Hashem covers Binyamin all day and rests between the ktefav. So there's one Braita, we said before that means that all of the chafifot, all of the coverings of Hashem happen over Binyamin. But there's a machloket actually in the Braita whether that's true or not. Because the first Braita says Kitznai. First Braita says Chofef alav means Zemikdash Rishon. That's referring to the first Beit HaMikdash. Kol hayom means Mikdash Sheni. Ben Tevav Shachin refers to Yemot HaMashiach. That's where Hashem covers Binyamin, but Hashem doesn't cover Binyamin with the Mishkan Shiloh, because Mishkan Shiloh was not in Binyamin, according to this Braita. But Rebbe Omer, remember Rebbe was the author before of the earlier Braita, Rebbe says, no, Chofef alav means Olam Hazeh. All of the coverings of Hashem, of the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash in this world are over Binyamin, including Mishkan Shiloh and Noven Givon and Beit Olamim. And when it says Kol Hayom, it means Yemot HaMashiach, and Ben Ktefav Shachin means Olam Haba. But the point of Rebbe is at least all of the chafifot in this world are over Binyamin, unlike the first Tana who said that only the Beit HaMikdash, not the Mishkan. So that is the machloket. Now we have a little bit more time, because we're going to take a little bit more time. I don't actually know how long it's been, but this is a very exciting and interesting Gemara. We are at the first of the intermediate lines on Daf Kuf Yud Chet Amud Bet. And the Gemara says, these are the dates. So we're about to do a lot of genealogy, chronology maybe is the word. You know, the interesting thing about Gemara chronology is that it is based obviously on traditions and on psukim, some psukim, many traditions. Very little historical data, obviously, for the first Beit HaMikdash or for Yetziat Mitzrayim or anything like that. So we have very few time points in order to sort of put these on a calendar. But the tradition that we have, just to remind everyone of a couple traditions, when Shlomo built the Beit HaMikdash, the pasuk in Melachim says it was the 480th year since they left Mitzrayim, right? Bihi b'shmonim v'arba me'ot shana from leaving Mitzrayim, and the pasuk is Melachim Aleph Perek Vav, first pasuk. Bihi b'shmonim shana v'arba me'ot shana l'tzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. That's when Shlomo built the Beit HaMikdash. Okay. Yeah, that's what it says. That's when Shlomo became king, let's say. 480 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now, two more things I just want to say. One is that it's pretty confident from the Chumash that we spent 40 years in the desert. So that makes 440 years from entering Eretz Yisrael until Shlomo became king and built the Beit HaMikdash. 440 years. That's a pasuk. Again, historical, it's a pasuk. If you look through Melachim, if you look through Shoftim, the psukim don't add up to anything like that, right? If you add all the different Shoftim and the different prophets, it doesn't add up. So we don't actually know all the years there. There's ways to look at it, but we don't have exact adding up. The tradition, which is based completely on tradition, there's not really an external source for this in a pasuk, I'm saying, is that the first Beit HaMikdash stood for 410 years. Okay, 410 years. And so if you do the math, which we learned in Sanhedrin, if you recall, between the moment from entering Eretz Yisrael to building the Beit HaMikdash was 440 years. It stood for 410 years, so there were 850 years from entering Israel until the Churban Bayit Rishon. That's the tradition, okay? Says the Braita, Tanu Rabbanan, Yimei Ohel Moed Shebemidbar. If you look at the days of the Ohel Moed in the desert, 40 shana chasar echad, 39 years, 40 years minus 1. They built the Mishkan in the second year, okay? So not the first year, but the second year. Yimei Ohel Moed Shebil Gilgal. Once they got into Eretz Yisrael, the first Mishkan was in Gilgal. That was 14 years, Arba Esrei Shana, 14 years. Sheva Shekivshu, the 7 years it took them to fight the wars and conquer the land, and Sheva Shechilku, and the 7 years it took them to divide the land. Then Yimei Ohel Moed Shebenovi Givon, we're not going in order here, right? So then from Gilgal it went to Shiloh, from Shiloh it went to Noven Givon. In Noven Givon, it was 57 years, Chamishim V'Sheva. We'll see all the math in a bit. So if you're basically saying, which I told you already, that there's 480 years from the entering Eretz, let's say 440, from entering Eretz Yisrael until they built the Beit HaMikdash, you just took out 14 years for Gilgal, 57 years for Noven Givon. What's left? Do the math. There's 369 years, 370 minus 1 left for Shiloh. So if you're counting from, the Gemara actually, it's a little confusing because they count from Yetziat Mitzrayim 480 years, but you don't count the first year. So basically you're 1 year short, but there's 369 years. The Mishkan was in Shiloh. That's all the remaining years. So it was in the desert, it was in Gilgal, it was in Shiloh, and then Noven Givon. Now, that's the Braita. Says the Gemara, how do we know any of this? How do you know 39 years of the Ohel Moed in the Midbar? Minala and Damar, because as we said, Shana Rishona, the first year, Asa Moshe at the Mishkan was the construction year. Moshe and everyone, right, built the Mishkan. Shniya, in the second year, Hukama Mishkan, Shalach Moshe Meraglim. In the second year, Moshe put up the Mishkan. Then he sent the Meraglim, and then they were stuck for another 39 years. Okay, then they got into Eretz Yisrael. Shabil Gilgal, the Oel Moed in Gilgal, we are at the second of the widest now, stood for 14 years. Arba Esrei. We said Sheva Shekivshu, Sheva Shechilko, 7 years of conquering the land, 7 years of dividing the land. Minolan, how do you know that? Damar Kalev, because at the end of the conquering, Kalev gets up and gives a speech, right? If you recall, in the middle of Yoshua. And Kalev's speech, which is a very fascinating speech because it's Kalev from Binyamin speaking to Yoshua. Sorry, the other way. Kalev from Yehuda speaking to Yoshua from Binyamin, right? So Yeshua's from Binyamin? I think so. So anyways, from somewhere in Yosef. No. Anyways, Kalev said the quote. Now we're quoting the pasuk in Yoshua. Ben arba'im shana anochi, b'shlach Moshe eved Hashem oti mikadesh barnei l'ragal ta'aretz. I was 40 years old when Moshe sent me to be one of the Meraglim. Of course, it's funny that Kalev was saying this to Yeshua, because Yeshua was also standing there. He was another one of the Meraglim. But either way, Kalev said, I was 40 years old when Moshe sent me. And remember, Ashev oto davar shek im kilavavi. I told him what was true. And he promised me this land. That's why Kalev was giving the speech, because I deserve this special place that Moshe said I get to get. So anyways, that's why he said the speech. But he says at the end of it, 2 psukim later, I'm 85 years today. So you know that from the time of the Meraglim until today was 85 years. So you do the math, right? When he crossed the Jordan, how old was Kalev? Bar Shivim Utamni. He was 78, because there were 38 years between the Meraglim, which is in the second year, and the 40th year when they left Mitzrayim, when they got into Eretz Yisrael. So he was 78 years old, and today he's 85. Now I'm 85. It took 7 years from the time they crossed the Jordan till Kalev got up and said, I'm ready to take my property. So it took 7 years to fight wars. And Sheva Shechilkum on, how do you know it took 7 years to divide the land? Some say, well, we don't really know, but Sheva Kivshu, Sheva Nami Chilku, took 7 for this, took 7 for that. That's the amount of time it took. But the other explanation by Dema, others say, is because otherwise the math doesn't work out. Otherwise, the psukim, there's a pasuk in the beginning of Parak Mem in Yecheskel, where Yecheskel says, maybe I'll read some of it, actually, because I love Yecheskel. This is Parak Mem in Yecheskel pasuk Aleph. It says, "Be'esrim v'chamesh shana legaluteinu b'Rosh Hashanah be'esor chodesh." Anyways, the 25th year of our galus, be'arba esrei shana achar shehukta ha'ir. On the 14th day after they destroyed the city, be'etzem hayom hazeh hayta yad ala yad Hashem. Hashem came to me. Anyways, now why does that matter? Because the Gemara says that it says in this pasuk I just read to you from the first pasuk in Yecheskel Mem, that it was on Rosh Hashanah on the 10th day of the month. Now you and I all know that Rosh Hashanah happens on the first day of the month. So the Gemara explains that in Yovel, remember in the 50th year, we had Rosh Hashanah on the day of Yom Kippur, right? That's when they blow the shofar. That's when people become free. So it must have been a year of Yovel. Now, if it's a year of Yovel, the issue is, how could there be a year of Yovel 14 years after the destruction of Beit HaMikdash? If what I told you, and I'm going to go back to my facts from before, there were 440 years from entering Eretz Yisrael till the built the Beit HaMikdash, and 410 years of the Beit HaMikdash. That's 850 years. If Yovel happens every 50 years, in 850 years, you have exactly 17 Yovels. So how could Yecheskel say 14 years after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, today's Yovel? It's not today Yovel. You're in the middle of a cycle. It must be that they didn't count Yovel for the first 14 years after they went into Eretz Yisrael. Why not? Because they were fighting wars. So 7 years, we know they fought a war. It must be there were 7 more years that they were dividing the land before they started counting the Yovel. And that's why you know that it took 14 years from when they went into Eretz Yisrael till they started counting Yovel. And that's why Yecheskel talks about 14 years after the destruction. Okay, that is a quick version. I'm happy to talk about it more in another time. Let's just try to finish the daf. Four lines from the bottom. Oel Moed Shebenov Givon 57. 57 years of Oel Moed in Nov and Givon after Shiloh. Minal, and how do we know 57 years? Because it says Vayhikas Kirot Aron Elohim. It says when it came to pass and they mentioned that the Aron was captured, Eli fell off his chair and died, and that was the end of Mishkan Shiloh. Vitana, we have a brayta that says K'shemeti Eli Kohen Charvas Shiloh, that the year that Eli died, Shiloh was destroyed. And then where did the Aron, not the Aron was captured, where did the Mizbeach go and the Beit HaMikdash? Bo Nov. They went to Nov. Now, of course, Nov was destroyed eventually by Shaul, unfortunately, because they protected David. Kishemet Shmuel Haramati, when the year that Shmuel died, that's when Charva Nov, that's when Nov was destroyed, and the Mishkan came to Givon, Boli Givon. No, it says, Vahi miyom shevet Haron b'kiryat Ye'arim, right? The Aron that was captured by the Plishtim, when they got it back, they put it in Kiryat Ye'arim. Vayarbu hayamim v'yu esrim shana. It was there for 20 years. V'yenu kol beit Yisrael achrei Hashem. And everyone yearned after Hashem. So you see that the Aron was there for 20 years. Harei hani esrim shania. These 20 years that the Aron was in Kiryat Ye'arim, remember at this time, the Mishkan was in Nov, but the Aron was not in Nov. So that was why Nov was a special kind of Mishkan. But these 20 years, says the Gemara at the bottom line, Eser Shana Shemalach Shmuel Batzmo. For 10 of them, Shmuel was the king. That Shmuel was not a king, as you recall. Shmuel was a Navi, but it means he was in charge. Shana Shemalach Shmuel v'Shaol. There was 1 year that he made Shaol the king, and basically they jointly were kings, meaning they were both in charge. V'Shtayim Shemalach Shaol. 2 years that Shaol was the king, and then Shevel David. And then there were 7 years of David, so that's 20 years. 10, 1, 2, and 7. That's based on the pasuk in Milachim, which says, in Shmuel, V'hayamim Shemalach David al Yisrael, the days in which David was, it's in the beginning of Milachim, the days that David was king on Yisrael, Arba'im Shana, it was 40 years, B'chevron Shemach Sheva Shanim, Yerushalayim 33 years, right? That's what the pasuk says. And by Shlomo it says, so again, we're doing all our years here, so you have to take 10 years of Shmuel, 1 year of Shmuel and Shaul, 2 years of Shaul on his own, 7 years of David in Hebron, 33 years of David in Yerushalayim, and that's almost there. And then by Shlomo, he didn't start building the Beit HaMikdash on day 1. It says Vayechal livnoto b'shnat arba l'malchuto. He started building it in the 4th year. So if you add up all those things, you get to 57. And so 57, do the math at home, but that's 57 years. Nishtaru l'shilo shlosh meot v'shivim chasar echat. If you do the math and you assume there's 480 years, right, and you have 39 of the desert and 14 of Gilgal and 57 of Nov and Givon, you've got 369 left over from Mishkan Shiloh. And we will stop here at the 2 dots on Daf Kuf Yutet Amud Aleph, and I wish everyone a Shavuot Tov.